Can everyone see my slides? There we are. There's the slides. Okay, so hello, everyone. My name is Ben Leibowicz. I'm an assistant professor in the Operations Research and Industrial Engineering program here at UT. And I'm going to be presenting our FSET project, which is titled Sectoral Feasibility of Greenhouse Gas Mitigation and Clean Energy Transitions. So my co-lead on this project, who you'll also hear from, is Dr. Joshua Busby. So he's actually on leave this semester working at the Department of Defense. So he's actually pre-recorded some remarks, which the producers here will be able to play in just a few minutes. So really, even though our project is quite broad and involves a number of different projects looking at decarbonization pathways for the United States, China, and India, for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on going into some detail on a paper which we just published in the journal Energy Policy. And this particular paper, which came out of our FSET project, is called Enhancing Policy Realism in Energy System Optimization Models, Politically Feasible Decarbonization Pathways for the United States. And what's quite unique about this interdisciplinary collaboration is that we were able to combine techno-economic analysis of decarbonization pathways with a thorough political feasibility analysis to understand, are there portfolios of policies targeting greenhouse gas emissions in individual sectors of the economy that, when added together, can achieve substantial decarbonization by the year 2050, and at what cost? So really, this was a unique effort to try to bring more policy realism into energy system optimization models, which usually these models only consider very high-level policies, like maybe an economy-wide carbon price, or they'll impose idealized constraints, like find the most cost-effective pathway for reducing emissions 80% by 2050. But often that kind of constraint is really just a modeling device. It's not a real policy which might be enacted in the real world. So really, we were trying to bring the types of policies that are actually being discussed in Washington into the mathematics of one of these energy system optimization models to show how we can evaluate these decarbonization pathways. So like I mentioned, it's a really interdisciplinary team that worked on this whole FSET project and on this particular paper in energy policy. So the lead author of this paper was my former PhD student, Chanru Zhu, who graduated in operations research last year, and she's now at the Electric Power Research Institute. So we certainly represent engineering on this team. And we also have 3 collaborators from the LBJ School of Public Affairs. So that's Josh Busby, Sarang Shidor, and an economist, Sheila Olmsted. And then we also have David Edelman from the School of Law. So quite an eclectic team. So really, the research questions that we wanted to investigate in this study was, first, from a methodological standpoint, how do we incorporate granular sector-specific decarbonization policies into one of these economy-wide, very macro-scale energy system optimization models? So moving beyond just looking at carbon prices and carbon caps and policies like that, to the types of granular policies that politicians are actually talking about in Washington. So things like credits, so investment tax credits, or funding for R&D, or fuel economy standards, or appliance efficiency standards, and how do we construct portfolios of those types of policies and actually model their economic and environmental impacts. Then certainly looking at the policies which the political scientists on our team deem politically feasible under different federal political environments, how much decarbonization can be achieved by 2050 if we assume different sets of policies might be available. And then the third bullet point is, how expensive is it to decarbonize the US economy using these portfolios of lots of different policies targeting individual sources of GHG emissions, compared to the less costly approach of using some economy-wide policy like a carbon price, or just telling the model, figure out the lowest cost pathway for achieving a certain reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Because according to economic theory, it should be more expensive to use all of these individual policies because they're not as efficient as something like an economy-wide carbon tax, because they specify and impose some rigidity on where the emissions reductions have to come from. So what we were curious is, in looking at, is how much more expensive is this more politically feasible policy approach of using these granular policy instruments? And then lastly, we'll use our results to investigate what are the sources of greenhouse gas emissions that, given the currently available sets of technologies and also the policies that are politically feasible at present, what emission sources feel like they're going to be difficult or would require additional policy and technology innovation to actually address. So I'll stop right there, and I'll let Josh Busby, through this video he recorded, tell you all about how the political scientists on our team constructed these portfolios of energy policies.
I'm Josh Busby, an associate professor in the LBJ School of Public Affairs. I'm sorry I can't be with you live today. I'm currently on leave serving as a senior climate advisor in the Department of Defense. I'm a political scientist by training and have been studying the political feasibility of the clean energy transition in the major economies for more than a decade. In previous research with my frequent collaborator, Sarang Shidore, we explored the sectoral feasibility of decarbonization in India and China, looking at the combination of political feasibility and techno-economic feasibility. It has long been our view that the scope for decarbonization is conditioned by the policy environment and what options are politically available. In previous research, we relied on techno-economic feasibility assessments largely carried out by others and brought our political economy insights to bear. In this research, we had the unique opportunity to work with modelers and build that techno-economic analysis from the ground up while we carried out our political feasibility analysis. For our contribution to the energy policy paper, we started with analysis of three key sectors: electricity, buildings, and transportation, which are responsible for a large share of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. In a series of working papers for the Energy Institute, we identified the suite of policies in the electricity, buildings, and transportation sectors that were actually being discussed in legislation and policy circles in the fall of 2020. These policies were roughly three different kinds: investments, taxes and subsidies, and mandates and standards. We model political feasibility of decarbonization pathways and three policy environments in order of increasing political support for climate action. Each scenario presumed a Democrat in the White House and a democratically controlled House, but varied in terms of political control of the Senate. In the low alignment scenario, Republicans retain control of the Senate. In the medium alignment scenario, Democrats attain a majority, but filibuster rules remained unchanged, meaning 60 votes are essentially needed to pass major legislation. In the high alignment scenario, Democrats win a majority and the filibuster was eliminated, lowering the threshold to a simple majority. In each of the three scenarios, different policies were identified as being politically available and then modeled for their mid-century impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Low alignment assumes a Republican-controlled Senate where traditionally Republican-supported measures are politically available, such as tax credits, research and development standards for federal procurement and regulations, and fossil industry-backed strategies such as carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The medium alignment portfolio assumes a Democratic-controlled Senate with the filibuster rules unchanged, and that includes more regulatory instruments such as sectoral carbon taxes, which are seen as market-friendly and possibly able to attract Republican support. The high alignment scenario assumes Democratic control of the Senate with no filibuster and includes more mandates and standards, such as a clean electricity standard. The way we approached coding political feasibility in each sector was to review the major pieces of legislation that were pending in Congress to see who their major supporters were. And we also reviewed the statements of key swing senators, such as Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. This analysis was carried out in the fall of 2020 and early January before the inauguration, January 2021, for the inauguration of President Biden. And by way of example, here's the graphic from our first working paper on the transportation sector. We identified different policies falling under each of the three categories: mandates and standards, investments, and taxes and subsidies. We reviewed what policies we thought were being actively discussed under each, such as a zero emission vehicle mandate and higher fuel economy standards in the cases of mandates and standards, charging infrastructure in the cases of investments, and zero emission vehicle tax credits under taxes and subsidies. We assessed which of these policies would have political support under each of these scenarios. This in turn served as the baseline information for the modelers to identify proxies in the model to assess the scope for decarbonization with available policy instruments for each of the three scenarios. This approach has the value of surfacing the political constraints to decarbonization and bring some greater policy realism to modeling. At the same time, the approach can also reveal some of the limits of the models where it is difficult to represent the effects, for example, of energy infrastructure networks. It also represents a static portrait of political feasibility today, which will likely change dramatically between now and 2050, as should the technology environment as well. So the analysis is provisional, but nonetheless is revealing about what is politically possible at this moment and how far that can get us to our deep decarbonization goals. And with that, I'll stop and I'll turn the presentation to my colleague, Ben Leibowicz. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Josh. So now I'm going to move on to describe our methodology, which was based on the Times Energy System Optimization Model. So this is a cost minimizing optimization model that identifies the least cost deployment of technologies across the economy and operations of those technologies in order to satisfy exogenous demands for energy service at the lowest possible cost. So the nice thing about the Times model is that it represents an entire economy, including energy supply sectors like resource extraction and electricity, all the way to end-use energy consuming sectors like transportation and buildings and industry. And in each of these sectors, it has a large menu of different technology options that it can choose to deploy in order to satisfy demands for all of these services at the lowest possible cost. And outputs of these models include things like, well, total cost of satisfying all of these demands for energy services, mixes of technologies as they're deployed and evolve over time, and also things like greenhouse gas emissions. So there are a lot of different versions of this Times model out there. The version for the United States is based on an input parameter database, which is developed and maintained by the EPA. So that's what we were able to get and use. So it divides the United States into 9 different regions, which you see depicted here. It includes really the entire energy economy, so sectors like electricity, buildings, transportation, and industry. The time horizon for the model is 2050. So we were looking at achieving various emissions benchmarks by the year 2050. And really a lot of the assumptions are synchronized with the EIA Annual Energy Outlook. Although if you read our paper, you'll see that we actually use some alternative sets of assumptions to see what effect they have on the results. So just to give you some brief sense of the results, so here's what happens to greenhouse gas emissions. So the blue and red lines are 2 different benchmarks. So the blue line is the business as usual case, where there's no energy or climate policy applied to the model. And the red line is essentially the idealized scenario where we tell the optimization model, find the most cost-effective way to achieve a goal of an 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. And otherwise, we don't actually implement any policies. We just allow the model to figure out the optimal way to get there. Whereas these three green lines are our low, medium, and high alignment portfolios that Josh just described. So you could see that if we take the currently available sets of technologies and also the policies which are politically feasible, even in a favorable federal political environment, we still don't get anywhere near the 80% reduction in economy-wide emissions by 2050. But we do, however, see a substantial reduction relative to the business as usual case. So then we can also look at what's going on in individual sectors. So this is emissions by sector. So the top left plot is business as usual. The top right plot is that 80% reduction, sort of model-based idealized pathway. And then across the bottom, you see low, medium, and high alignment and what those actual policies Josh described are able to achieve. So you could see that some sectors are going to decarbonize much more easily than others. So certainly to achieve any real ambitious emissions reduction economy-wide, the electricity sector is really the most favorable and essentially has to approach zero emissions by 2050 in order to achieve anything large on an economy-wide scale. But then you could see in other sectors, these portfolios of granular policies don't really get close to how much emissions would have to fall in order to reach that 80% reduction. So I'll just quickly show you some results from the other sectors. So here we have electricity, where unsurprisingly, in order to achieve an 80% reduction, you need very large growth in zero carbon sources like solar and wind and even nuclear power. You can also see that the total amount of electricity that the generation system needs to provide is much, much larger if you're aiming for those ambitious emissions reductions economy-wide. And that's because other sectors like transportation and buildings, their most effective way to decarbonize is through electrification. But of course, that requires more clean energy to be produced. So here in transportation, you could see that in every scenario except for business as usual, there's some delayed but noticeable electrification of the transportation fuel mix by certainly 2040, 2050, but you could see that there's certain parts of the transportation fuel mix and emission sources which are more stubborn. So that certainly goes for diesel, which is associated with like trucking, medium and heavy duty vehicles, and also jet fuel, so aviation. So this goes to show that the politically feasible set of policies are fairly effective by 2050 in electrifying and decarbonizing light-duty passenger vehicles, but there are other parts of the transportation energy mix which are harder to decarbonize. And then similarly in buildings, we see that these policy portfolios struggle to reduce natural gas use in buildings as much as the ideal pathway to the 80% overall reduction. So one very important result from our analysis we found is that unsurprisingly and in line with economic theory, it is more expensive to reduce emissions per ton of greenhouse gas emissions avoided through these granular sets of policies as opposed to the idealized least cost way of achieving these objectives. However, one interesting thing that we note is as we move from low to medium to high alignment, you simultaneously get more emissions reductions from those portfolios, but also the average cost of achieving the reductions goes down because as the political environment enables more cost-effective, higher-level policies, you're able to both reduce emissions by more and rely on more economically efficient policy instruments. So the gap does narrow as you go to more emissions reductions. So just to summarize our key findings, most cost-effective near-term decarbonization opportunities are in the electricity sector. To achieve ambitious emissions reductions economy-wide, the electricity sector and then electrification of those end uses is going to have to play a really major role. And really, the optimal decarbonization strategy for the economy as a whole relies on these synergistic relationships across sectors, which is why it's very important to use a model like TIMES. So also, like I mentioned, it is more expensive to decarbonize the US economy using the current politically viable approach of relying on these very specific policy instruments. However, we do see that the gap between the most cost-effective solutions and what's achievable politically in terms of their average abatement cost does narrow as you allow more of these policy instruments to be in play. And also we see that based on the estimates of these costs per ton of CO2, they're still lower than mainstream estimates of the social cost of carbon. And therefore, even if they're not the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions, they still probably produce net benefits for society relative to the business as usual case. So as far as policy implications, certainly infrastructure transformation is going to be needed to provide a lot of clean electricity generation. A complementary set of policy tools, including mandates and standards, investments, and tax credits, is really the most cost-effective approach. And then we highlighted some sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which will need further innovation in technology policy in order to really substantially address. So things like natural gas use in buildings, emissions from the industrial sector, medium and heavy duty vehicles all fall under that umbrella. We made this point that sectoral policies should not be assessed in isolation because there are important synergies and trade-offs across sectors of the economy. And we showed that on the one hand, the economy can be decarbonized quite a bit by 2050 for quite modest costs, but getting to 80% will require new technologies and policies to become feasible between now and 2050. So I'll stop my presentation right there. And here's just a reference to our recent paper in energy policy if you'd like to learn more about our work.